Good morning. The other video that I shot for this didn't turn out so well. There was a sound issue, and so I'm reshooting it this morning. I feel this is a really important thing that I need to go over and I need to talk to you guys about. So I've got the slides up and I've got another exhibit that I'm going to show you. The camera's going to bounce a little bit because I don't have time to edit this out or do it in Final Cut or anything, so just sort of bear with me. So what we're talking about, what I want to address is the idea of doing an industry analysis / competitor analysis, that sort of thing. First of all, that big list of sources of secondary research resources that I gave you is perfectly valid for beginning this, but it's very important that you ask people in the industry to figure out what the 5 most important things are in the industry, because they're going to have probably a different idea than, especially like a trade journal. In a trade journal there's a lot of good information, but in general the people who are writing in a trade journal have an agenda, and the people who are advertising in a trade journal have an agenda. So whatever their agenda item is going to be the most important thing for business, whether it is or not. So it's better to talk to someone, especially if you have a friendly contact in business, and try to talk to several of them and get examples of what they really think are the important things. Now I'm going to focus this on the slides, and then my face won't be visible, which is probably a blessing, but you'll be able to follow along with the slides. Okay. This is less than ideal. Okay. There we go. Alright, so all of the secondary market resources, as I just mentioned, are perfectly usable. In addition to that, primary research is good. Figure out who your competitors are. Figure out who the key competitors are. Not everybody who's involved in the same business you're in is a key competitor. You're not interested in someone who is not particularly, making an impact in the industry. You're not interested in someone who's a part-time player. You're not interested in someone who does something on the side or occasionally. If you're going into a grocery business, Walmart is important, and the Speedway station probably is not. There's different ways to figure out who's important, and if you need help with that, we can talk about it. But what you need to do is put those competitors in a chart, figure out how they're competing and how, and then you can decide how you're going to compete with them. That was pretty much the whole thing, but just saying it's probably not going to be the best way to get it across, so I've got an example for you. This is a competitive landscape table that I made for the locksmith business. I actually just made this one. Let's see if we can go to 200% and still see it. No. Okay, so let's try 150. Alright, there we go. So this is for the locksmithing business in Muncie, Indiana, circa 1995. These are the competitors that were in the area. Jones Lock Shop, Bickles Lock and Key, A1 Locksmith, Hickory Trail Lock Shop, Bowden Lock and Security Certified Master Locksmith. There were also 6 or 8 other people. There was a new locksmith every year, and usually they would come in and go out of business in that same year. So as I was preparing my business plan, I did this exact exercise that I'm telling you to do now. And what I did is I found out what things, first of all, what did I think might be important. And I said I thought the hours that someone was open might be important, whether or not they had a shop, because in the locksmith business, a lot of the people in the business simply didn't have a physical location that you could go to. Whether or not they had high security equipment, like they could do work that maybe other people couldn't do. That becomes important for a number of reasons later on. Whether or not they could open safes. whether or not they could fix safes, how quickly they got to a job, whether they were expensive or inexpensive, how much money they spent on marketing and where they spent it, whether they were repair-oriented or replace-oriented. That is, if you had something that was broken, did they try to fix it or did they just try to sell you a new one? Whether or not they could do master keying, which is where you can make one key work several different things, and whether or not they offered billing or if everybody had to pay cash. So those things were all important, I thought. And the first thing that I discovered when I was compiling this table is that if we go to line number 13, master key ability, every single locksmith can do it. So that means that there's no way to tell businesses apart based on whether or not they can use that particular thing. So that is sort of a minimum standard for entry. It's not something that can be used to gain a competitive advantage, or at least not easily. Because if everyone can do it, it's not something that can be made a premium product or service or be featured. So that was something that once I found out everyone could do it, there was no use looking any further and figuring out how to leverage it. Next, if you see repair and replace here, there were lots of places that said repair and lots of places that said replace. It was about evenly split. And it didn't seem to make much of a difference. As I talked to locksmiths, I would ask them how much money did they make on something repairing it and how much money did they make replacing it. It didn't seem to make a large degree of difference to the price they offered the customer, and it didn't seem to make a large degree of difference to the amount of profit they made. The one exception was Hickory Trail Lock Shop, which is the lock shop that I eventually came to own and was in that business. But he made a lot more money off of repairing products, but he had made an extensive investment for years and years and years. Any old product that he got, like if he took the locks off someone's house and put new locks on it, he would take the old things home, repair them, catalog them, set them on a shelf, and then they would be there, and he would essentially have zero expense in it other than his time, and that's what he was doing with his time anyway. It was sort of a leisure recreational activity that he would do. So that gave him in particular a great advantage in that he could make a lot more profit off selling essentially the same thing. But for the most part, that wasn't a major factor. It also turned out that marketing and price were not major factors, which I was actually really, really surprised. But in talking to customers, price was not really very important to them. Now, if I had told someone that it was going to be $1,000 to unlock their car, price would have suddenly become a factor. But at that time, the cheapest that anyone would unlock a car for was $25, and the most anyone would charge was $45. And to the customer, the difference between $25 and $45 was essentially zero. They were far more concerned with response time. So anyone who had a faster response time had an advantage. In talking to customers and other locksmiths, the things that really drove success were response time. Most important was hours of operation. And hours of operation, there were only 2 locksmiths in the area that actually were true 24-hour, 7-day-a-week operations. A1 Locksmith here claimed to be a 24-hour operation, but when they didn't feel like working, when actually he didn't feel like working because it was a one-man operation, he just didn't pick up his phone. And as a result, people who used him and people who used these other companies that were, limited hours, if they needed something done at 11 o'clock at night, they couldn't get a hold of their regular locksmith. So they eventually got a hold of one of the 24-hour locksmiths. And then once the 24-hour locksmith went out there and did a good job, if the person on site was doing a good job selling for his company, he would say something like, well, if you're willing to call us at 11 o'clock at night, we'd love to have your business at 11 o'clock in the morning. And so what happened is, over time, business flowed to the companies that had 24-hour service as opposed to those who didn't. And that, that for a success factor, that made hours the single most important success factor in the locksmith business. After that was the response time, because it was super important to the customers. After that was 7 and 8 listed here, which are safe opening and safe service, because this is something that takes a large amount of investment and a large amount of skill. And companies that couldn't do this would often, just like you would lose based on not being open at 11 o'clock at night, after a while companies would get tired of calling one person out to rekey their doors and another person out to change the combination on their safe. So eventually, if you had those options, you could convert partial customers into full customers. The next important thing was billing. To work for a lot of large companies, you simply had to be willing to offer the service of taking 30 days or 60 days to pay. If you didn't offer that, they weren't particularly interested in doing business with you at all, because a factory doesn't keep cash on hand to pay for large expenses like this. They're used to having a longer horizon for that sort of stuff. So that's what they did. They these factories and even cash handling businesses oftentimes want to have a purchase order and pay over 30 days. So if you're willing to let them bill you and somebody else is not, then you can eventually capture that business. Finally, having the option for high security is important to the customer, because the customer knows that that their employees can't go to Lowe's and get a copy of their key. But more importantly, once you install a proprietary locking system into someone's business, the switching cost is very expensive. It might be $1,500 to put in a locking system, and then to come out and rekey it if they lose a key or if someone tries to break in, might be $200 or $300. But if no other company is able to use your equipment, then they have to switch out all of your equipment. So the choice to the company at that point, when they need to have their locks redone, is do they pay your company $300, or do they pay a new company $1,500 to come in and take care of the problem? So that's how I put together a competitive landscape table for the locksmithing business. The specifics of your business is something that we'll have to discuss as you figure out your business. So we will discuss those with your businesses one-on-one. And if you have questions on that, we can email back and forth or whatever. But that's the basic process. And the keys to the process are figuring out what variables matter in the industry, and then figuring out which ones are the most important. 5 is a good number. If maybe you need to include a 6th one or a 7th one because of the specifics of your industry, that's perfectly okay. But if you do the top 5, you're going to capture probably 80% of the most important stuff to a specific business. So focus on those 5 things. Find out what they are from a variety of sources. Then use your best judgment to pick the ones that you think matter most. On that list, at least one locksmith and at least one or more customers told me that that was one of the top 5 most important things. Someone told me that having a shop was the most important thing. It just turned out that it wasn't. Someone told me that price was very, very important, and I was inclined to agree with them. I thought price would be the determining factor for a lot of this. But almost no decision in the locksmithing arena, at least that I came across, was price the major decision point. I thought marketing would be important, and marketing is always important. It really is. But as far as being the most important thing for the business, as long as people were aware your company existed, it didn't really matter. We had people who would do half-page ads in the phone book, and we had people who would do a 2-inch inline ad. One of the companies on there, Jones Lock Shop, ran a 2-inch inline ad in the phone book, which was the primary method of advertising at that time. And that's all they ran. That's all they ever ran. They never ran in any additional numbers, any additional advertisements, and they were the second largest operator in the region from that 2-inch ad. So obviously their business was not being driven by their advertising. And the repair replace oriented, obviously that was a huge factor to Hickory Trail Lock Shop, but it really didn't matter to anyone else. Maybe because they weren't willing to do it to the extent that he was, but for whatever reason, not so much an issue. And the master keying ability, I had a locksmith tell me people like to use me because I can set up master keys. And that seemed like a reasonable thing, and I was fairly new in the business. I didn't know every single person could do that. So if everybody can do it, it's obviously not an issue. Okay, that's all for this video. Hope you enjoy it, and hopefully we'll do a couple more over the weekend, and you'll get entire lectures, and we'll have a shortened class session next week because we have a holiday. Thanks, and have a great day. Bye.